It started with a feeling, the kind of unease you can't quite name. It was the mid-1970s in Oakland County, Michigan. This was the suburbs, the American dream. Good schools, green lawns, safe streets. Where kids rode their bikes everywhere. They played outside until the streetlights came on. It was a place built on the idea that nothing truly bad could happen here. But that was about to change. A shadow fell over the county. It would last for just over a year, but the darkness it left behind is still there. This is the story of the Oakland County child murders, a series of kidnappings and killings that terrified a generation of parents and children. The press and the police gave the killer a nickname. They called him the Babysitter. It's a chilling name. It wasn't because he was a literal babysitter, it was because of what he did to the children after he took them. He held them for days, he fed them, he bathed them, he cared for them in a way that was almost tender. And then he killed them. He arranged their bodies carefully, almost peacefully, for someone to find. He was the caretaker and the executioner. He was the monster who acted like a friend, right up until the very end. The first victim was Mark Stebbins. He was 12 years old. It was February 15th, 1976, from a Sunday. Mark had an argument with his mother. It was a typical kid and parent thing. He wanted to go to the local hobby shop. She said no. He got angry and stormed out of their home in Ferndale. He was supposed to go to a friend's house. He never made it. When Mark didn't come home, his parents started to worry. That worry grew into panic. They called the police. Friends and family started searching. They called his name in the streets, they checked the parks and the woods. Nothing. For 4 days, there was no sign of Mark Stebbins. People hoped he was just a runaway. A kid who got mad and would come home when he cooled off. But deep down, a different fear was taking hold. On Thursday, February 19th, a woman was driving to work. She saw something in a snowbank on the side of an I-75 service drive in Southfield. A body, a small body. It was Mark. He was fully dressed. His body was laid out neatly. His arms were crossed over his chest. An autopsy would later show that he had been held for several days. He had been fed. He had been washed. Then he was strangled. There was also evidence of sexual assault. The news hit the community like a physical blow. This wasn't supposed to happen here. A child doesn't just disappear and turn up dead in a snowbank. The police had very little to go on. No witnesses, no real forensic evidence. It was the 1970s. DNA technology was science fiction. They had fingerprints and fibers, but that was about it. They interviewed people, and they chased down leads, but they had nothing solid. The case was a mystery from the start. People tried to move on. They tried to believe it was a one-time tragedy, a horrible, random act of violence that wouldn't be repeated. They were wrong. Just over a month later, it happened again. This time, it was a girl named Jill Robinson. She was also 12 years old. She lived in Royal Oak. On December 22nd, 1976, she had a fight with her mother. She ran out of the house. It was a cold, snowy day. She was last seen near a hobby shop on Main Street. The witnesses said she was upset, crying. A man might have been talking to her. But the descriptions were vague. Like with Mark, Jill's family was thrown into a nightmare. They waited, they prayed, they searched. The police put out bulletins. Her face was in the newspapers and on TV. 4 days passed. Christmas came and went. For the Robinson family, there was no celebration. There was only the gnawing, empty fear. On December 26th, a motorist saw something near the same interstate, I-75, in Troy. It was a body, partially covered in snow, lying by the side of the road. It was Jill. She was also fully dressed. Her body was clean. The killer had placed her there carefully. She had been held for days, she had been fed, and then she had been killed. This time, the cause of death was a shotgun blast to the face. It was brutal. It was terrifying. Now, the fear in Oakland County was real. It was tangible. This wasn't a random act anymore. This was a pattern. 2 kids, both 12 years old. Both disappeared after an argument with their parents. Both found dead alongside I-75 a few days later. The police knew they had a serial killer on their hands. They formed a task force. Dozens of officers from different departments came together. The investigation became the highest priority. They called it the Oakland County Child Killer Task Force. The new year, 1977, began under a cloud of dread. Parents stopped letting their kids walk to school alone. They weren't allowed to go to the park by themselves. The simple freedom of being a kid was gone. Every strange car, every unknown adult was a potential threat. The stranger danger mantra that would define a generation of parenting was born in the fear of those months. And the killer wasn't done. On January 2nd, 1977, a 10-year-old girl named Kristine Mihelich disappeared. She was from Berkeley, another one of Oakland County's quiet, family-oriented towns. She was walking to a local convenience store to buy a magazine. It was a short walk. A walk she had made countless times before, but this time she never came back. The search for Kristine was massive. Police, volunteers, even the National Guard joined in. Her face was everywhere. The task force was desperate for a break. They had a few witness accounts. Some people saw a girl matching Kristine's description in a blue AMC Gremlin or a similar looking car. The driver was a white male. Again, the descriptions were vague. It wasn't much to go on. The wait for news about Kristine was agonizing. It stretched on much longer than with the other children. Days turned into weeks. The winter was cold and bleak. For 19 days, her family and the entire community lived in a state of suspended horror. Everyone hoped she would be found alive, but they also feared the worst. On January 21st, a mail carrier found her body. She was in a snowy ditch in a rural area of Franklin Village. Just like Mark and Jill, she was fully dressed. Her body had been placed there carefully. The autopsy revealed the same chilling pattern. She had been held captive, she had been washed and fed, she had been sexually assaulted, and then she was smothered. 3 children were now dead. The community was on the edge of hysteria. The pressure on the police was immense. They had interviewed hundreds of people. They had looked into local sex offenders. They chased every lead, no matter how small. But the killer was like a ghost. He left no clues behind. The crime scenes were clean. The way he placed the bodies seemed like a taunt. He was showing them that he had cared for these children, that he had control, and that they were powerless to stop him. The task force was getting desperate. They even brought in psychics. One famous Dutch psychic, Peter Herkos, came to Michigan. He claimed to have visions. He touched the victims' clothing and described scenes of their captivity. He gave the police names and locations. It was a media spectacle, but none of it led to an arrest. It was a sign of how helpless everyone felt. They were willing to try anything. The final confirmed victim was a boy named Timothy King. He was 11 years old. He lived in Birmingham, one of the more affluent cities in the county. On March 16, 1977, Timothy went out to visit a friend. He had about 30 cents in his pocket. He was planning to buy some candy. He left his house and started walking toward the drugstore. He never got there. When he didn't return home for dinner, his father, Barry King, went out to look for him. The Kings were a well-known family. Barry was a successful lawyer. He had connections. When Timothy was reported missing, the response was immediate and huge, but the story was sickeningly familiar. A child was gone. This time, however, something was different. The King family decided to go on television. Timothy's mother, Marion, and his sister, Kathy, made a public plea. They spoke directly to the kidnapper. They didn't sound angry or accusatory. They sounded like a desperate mother and sister. Kathy begged the kidnapper to let her brother call home. She told him that Timothy knew their phone number by heart. Then, Marion King spoke. She told the kidnapper that Timothy had to be home for dinner. She said his favorite meal was his father's fried chicken. We're waiting for you, Tim, she said, her voice breaking. It was a heart-wrenching moment. The entire region watched, hoping this public appeal might somehow reach the person who had their son. The plea seemed to work, but not in the way anyone had hoped. It seemed the killer was watching. He heard her. A few days later, a witness came forward. They remembered seeing Timothy at a diner with a man. They said Timothy was eating fried chicken. The killer had taken him for his last meal. The meal his mother had mentioned on television. It was an act of unimaginable cruelty. A final, sadistic twist of the knife. 6 days after he disappeared, Timothy King's body was found. And he was in a ditch in Livonia, a neighboring county. His skateboard was nearby. Just like the others, he was clean and fully dressed. He had been sexually assaulted and then suffocated. His body had been carefully placed. With Timothy's murder, the terror in Oakland County reached its peak. Had 4 children dead in just over a year. A killer who seemed to be a step ahead of everyone. As a killer who was so bold, so arrogant, that he took his last victim out for a meal mentioned on TV. Then the killings stopped. As suddenly as they began, they were over. But the questions and the fear remained. Who was the babysitter? And why did he stop? The investigation continued for years, but it grew cold. The task force eventually disbanded. The files were put away. But the case was never forgotten. For the families of the victims, there was no moving on. For the police who worked the case, it was the one that haunted them. And for the people who grew up in Oakland County during that time, it changed their childhoods forever. Over the years, many suspects have been looked at. The case is a complex web of theories, circumstantial evidence, and dead ends. There was never enough direct proof to charge anyone, but a few names have come up again and again. One of the most prominent theories involves a group of men who were part of a pedophile ring in the affluent Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills area. At the center of this theory is a man named Christopher Bush. Bush was the son of a wealthy General Motors executive. He had been convicted of sexually assaulting a young boy years earlier, but he got off with probation. He was a known predator. Bush fit the profile in many ways. He drove a car similar to the one seen with Kristine Mihelich. He lived in the area, and he knew some of the victims' families, at least socially. The most compelling evidence against him came after he died. In 1978, a year after the last murder, Bush killed himself. He left a strange suicide note. When police searched his home, they found things that connected him to the case. They found newspaper clippings about the murders. More importantly, forensic investigators later found that fibers from a carpet in his home were a potential match to hairs found on 2 of the victims. It was a strong link, but it wasn't definitive proof. And because he was dead, he could never be questioned or put on trial. Connected to Bush were other men, including his business partner, Gregory Green. 3 decades later, Green was convicted on child pornography charges. People who knew Bush and Green claimed they hosted parties where young boys were abused. Some sources have suggested that the murders were committed to silence children who knew too much about this ring. The theory is that the killer, or killers, were powerful, well-connected men who were protected by their status in the community. It's a dark and disturbing possibility that a conspiracy of silence allowed them to get away with murder. Another name that often comes up is James Vincent Gunnels. He was a convicted sex offender who also lived in the area. He was questioned by police at the time but was never charged. He also later killed himself in a prison. He remains a person of interest, but the evidence against him is also circumstantial. For a time, police even considered notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy from Chicago. The timing of his murders overlapped, but his methods were different. Gacy buried his victims in his crawlspace. The Oakland County child killer displayed his victims in public. Most investigators have dismissed Gacy as a suspect in these specific cases. Then there was Arch Sloan, a local con man who falsely confessed to the murders. He did it for attention. He sent the police on a wild goose chase before admitting he made it all up. He was just one of the many dead ends that plagued the investigation. The lack of a resolution has been a source of immense pain. Barry King, Timothy's father, never gave up. He spent the rest of his life searching for answers. He became a fierce critic of the original investigation, believing it was mishandled. He followed leads himself. He pushed for the case to be reopened. He believed that powerful people were involved and that there had been a cover-up. He died in 2011 without ever knowing for sure who killed his son. In recent years, there has been new hope. Law enforcement agencies have reopened the case. They are using modern DNA technology to re-examine the evidence collected in the 1970s. It's a long shot. The evidence is old and may have degraded, but it's a chance, and a chance to finally get a definitive answer. They have exhumed the bodies of some suspects, including Christopher Bush, to get DNA samples. They have tested hairs and fibers found on the victims. So far, there has been no public announcement of a conclusive match. But the work continues. The investigators now are the children of the investigators from the 1970s. The case has been passed down through a generation. The story of the Oakland County child killer is more than just a true crime mystery. It's a story about the loss of innocence, not just for the 4 children who were murdered, but for an entire community. The fear that the babysitter created changed the way people lived. It ended the era of unlocked doors and unsupervised play. It taught a generation of kids that the world was not a safe place, that monsters were real, and they could live right next door. The 4 children, Mark Stebbins, Jill Robinson, Kristine Mihelich, and Timothy King, should not be remembered as just victims. They were kids with families who loved them. They had favorite foods and hobbies and friends. Mark loved to build models. Jill was known for her sense of humor. Kristine was a bright and happy girl. Timothy loved his skateboard. They had entire lives ahead of them, lives that were stolen. The case remains officially unsolved. The killer may have died years ago, taking his secrets with him. Or he could still be alive, an old man living with the knowledge of what he did. We may never know for sure, but the questions linger. Who was he? Why did he do it? And what made him stop? The shadow that fell over Oakland County in 1976 has never fully lifted. It remains a haunting reminder of a time when a predator roamed the suburbs, preying on children. A killer who earned the name Babysitter because of his twisted, horrifying ritual of care and cruelty. And for the families and the community he terrorized, the case will never be cold. It is a wound that has never healed. The search for justice, even after all these years, continues. The hope is that one day, a name can finally be put to the shadow, and the 4 children can finally rest in peace.